Hey, Mission Hills Church, welcome back to the Continuing the Conversation feed here on our Messages podcast. You're back with Colin and
Craig.
And we are in the heart of our Beyond series now. I mean, we have kicked things off. We have the website built. We've given out the booklets, and we're really into kind of going through the bigger picture of what God has, this plan of generosity in your lives. And I'm really excited for it.
I am too. Absolutely. In my own life as well as the life of our congregation, God's definitely doing some stuff in my heart that's it's good stuff. It's not always comfortable, but I'm really glad it's happening.
Doesn't that always seem to be the case where you're like, all right, God, I've really hit my stride here. I am comfortable. You have taught me some stuff in this area of my life. And God goes, great, now let's change. Let's move it. Let's do more. Let's pick up the pace. Let's slow it down. And it's always this kind of like a change into the comfortability.
Yeah. So I have a mentor. His name's Jim, and I'm learning a lot from him right now. He said a really interesting thing the other day, and he was specifically thinking in the context of generosity, but I think this is true more generally, and so I'm going to say it in more general terms. He said that the difference between what you're comfortable doing for God and what God is actually calling you to do, that gap is actually how much God wants to grow you. That's the growth potential in your life. And I'm like, oh, I don't like that at all. I mean, as a leader, love that. That's powerful. As a follower, he's totally right, and I wish he weren't right? Because I'm comfortable with this, and I'm comfortable pushing the envelope a little bit. But God's going, no, I want you to trust me here. Oh, that's my growth potential. Ooh, I feel that one.
Especially when you start to look at it and you go, that's not necessarily like a rung or two up. We're looking at the Grand Canyon here between where he wants to push us into.
Which always feels like that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's going, no, we can get there. We can get there quickly too. If you're, in my pacing here, it's going to seem painful to you, but we got this here.
For sure.
It's always, I think you and I have talked about this too, kind of personality trait wise. I love the fact that God is in control. It is a huge reassurance to me in my life because I do not like to be in control in a whole lot of areas. Maybe when March Madness kicks on here with the weekend coming up, I like to have the TV control here. But the fact that I can lay my worries aside in a lot of these different areas and that God's got this is always kind of this thing that I can fall back on. So,
and I envy that about you. I'm a little bit more of a control freak. So that is a good, healthy way to be. I wrestle with getting to that point where I can do that.
Well, I tell you, the imposter syndrome kicks in, and most of the time I just feel like I'm being lazy. And I'm like, is this a point where I really am trusting God, or am I just being lazy in the fact that I'm giving it to God and I'm not having to worry about it? So don't worry, there's still tension there.
All right. Always tension. But tension's how we make music, right?
Hey, there we go. I like that. Yeah. So I want to start off today by talking just, was there anything left on the cutting room floor of this message this week? Just because this one was a different perspective on a story that we've heard before. And there was a couple different key lenses and you took a different path kind of into the story that we've heard before. So I'm wondering what the creation of it looked like this week. Just
backstory on some of it.
Into the pastor's brain, because I think if you guys don't know, Craig actually sits down Mondays most of the time, right? And you kind of start writing some stuff down and you work on it early in the week, and then on Tuesdays he actually presents it to kind of a myriad of different people from our staff here to get some different perspectives on it.
It's actually a little longer process than that. So Monday morning, I write the message that I haven't written yet, and that's usually several weeks out. So the message I preached this weekend, I started writing that 6 weeks ago. So doing a lot of the study, the reflection, praying, jotting down ideas, kind of creating a map through the passage. And then Monday afternoon, I pull out the message for that coming weekend.
Yes, okay.
And that's usually my second or third time kind of doing a revision, and then we do I call it sermon pitch to a team on Tuesday, and then that becomes the input and the feedback for a third or a fourth or a fifth kind of reiteration, and so there's definitely a process. Yeah. So stuff on the cutting. There's always stuff on the cutting room floor. One, I just didn't feel like I had a whole lot of time, and honestly, a lot of people wouldn't have even cared. But I had a little bit of a different take on Abram going to Egypt, and I said this weekend, I think that was a mistake. I don't think he was supposed to do that. And I had a couple people email me and go, hey, I hadn't really heard that before. What's the thinking there? And so first off, I could be wrong. I mean, in all humility, it's entirely possible I'm wrong. I would say, however, that my take that Abram going to Egypt was a mistake, I'm not the only one saying that. I definitely.
Yeah, this isn't the Craig interpretation Bible here.
Yeah, it's not a radical view that I suddenly came up with. Lots of other scholars that I respect end up the same place. I usually try to do these things myself and then check myself against other scholars. And if I find something that nobody else is saying, then I'm always like, oh, hang on a second. In general, I feel like there's power in the community of people, community of faith, recognizing stuff. And so it's always, if like I haven't heard this before, I want to see if anybody else is saying this. And in this particular case, there's lots of people saying the same kind of thing. But yeah, some people were asking, how did you decide that it was a bad thing? And I think there's a couple pieces. It doesn't explicitly say. God never says this was wrong. However, there's a couple pieces to it. Number one, and this is, I think, just helpful to kind of, like, here's how I think through stuff like this, a good example of that. Number one, it was very clear from the text, God had called him into the promised land and promised to provide for him in the promised land, right? There's no indication, there's nothing in the text that says God said, oh, the famine is hit, you need to get out of the promised land. That would be a little bit weird. Come here and I'll provide for you, and then things get hard, and like, oh, like I can't provide for you here, you're going to have to leave. And some people have probably asked the question, well, wait a minute, but isn't that exactly what happened with Israel later on? Because there was a famine, and then Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain, and that's where Joseph was. And I don't think it's the same situation because, number one, God clearly orchestrated things so that Joseph was in power. Genesis 50:20, I think it says, Joseph said, hey, to his brothers, you intended this for evil, but God intended it for good, the saving of many lives. So clearly God was orchestrating there. But even then, Israel didn't go down to Egypt immediately. Jacob, their father, knew I'm supposed to stay in the promised land because he didn't have any word from God not to. So yeah, he sent his sons down, but it was to buy stuff and then bring it back. So I actually don't think that's a good example of going to Egypt is a good idea. Now, once it became clear that God had orchestrated some things, it's a different context, but I don't think that applies to the Abram situation at all because there is no indication God has orchestrated. There's no call from God to leave here. And then there's the fact that when they got down there, what they did was bad there, and there's no way to get around that, right? So they made a decision that's not justified, I would say, in the text, and then they did some stuff while they were down there that like everybody would go, that's messed up. You shouldn't be doing that, right? I'm talking about Abram telling his wife, hey, let's pretend that you're my sister, and we'll see how that goes, right? Oh, by the way, also I had a question from somebody going, well, you sort of indicated that Sarai didn't just go into Pharaoh's household, but that there might have been some hanky-panky going on in there, and it doesn't say that. So why would you make that assertion? Again, same kind of a thing. It's not explicit in the text, but in the larger context, there are some other issues. So one of them would be, ironically, Abram does this exact same thing in Genesis 20. He pulls it's with a guy named Abimelech. He's like, hey, tell everybody you're my sister. And he kind of justified, there's some extended family dynamics, it's kind of sort of true. So it's not really a lie. But it's interesting in that case, same thing happens. Abimelech takes Sarai in as his wife, but it explicitly says that the Lord kept him from having relations with her. And then it becomes clear what's happened, that he's actually Abram's wife, and Abimelech goes to Abram and is like, dude, what's the problem? Why would you do this to me, right? I was spared by the Lord from horrific things happening to my house by sinning against her. Fortunately, I didn't, because God kept me from doing it. So that's what's interesting is, in that case, it's the same scenario. In that case, the Lord kept Abimelech from sleeping with Sarai. And Abimelech recognizes, if I had slept with her, there would have been a curse on my house, so to speak. Okay, so that's how it worked there. But in this Genesis 12 situation, there's no statement that Pharaoh was kept from sleeping with her. And the curse does come upon his house, the implication being, oh, he had done it. So I would say, the better argument is, no, it actually did happen. Or they would have said that it didn't. The curse wouldn't have come upon the house, those kinds of things. So sometimes that context matters. And by the way, also even in the idea of Abram going down being a bad thing, in the context, the Germans have a phrase called the Sitzum Leben. It means the situation in life in which a text is received, a biblical text was received. And so Moses was writing Genesis to the Israelites as they were on the edge of going into the promised land. And they were dealing with, there's problems in the promised land. There's big people. We got to fight for them. And there was a temptation. Let's go back to Egypt. So I think partly the Abram going to Egypt story and bad things happening there was a way of kind of warning the Israelites, don't go back to Egypt. It's not a good idea. So all those things together make, for me, an argument, and again, for several other scholars, that no, Abram going to Egypt was not the right move. So that's just, I think it's worth talking about simply to go, I don't, sometimes I do say stuff that people come up to me and they're like, I've never heard that before. Like, I'm not looking to be radical. I'm trying to follow the text and the evidence, and then I'm checking it against other scholars. And when I say something that might be not the Sunday school version of it, and maybe a lot of people haven't heard it, but then I check it against other scholars. I'm like, oh, you're saying the same stuff that I am. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share that, but not necessarily with all the details, because not everybody's looking for all the details. So, that was a lot of exegetical information there.
No, that was great. There's a couple rabbit trails I want to chase there. One, can you imagine how scary the Giants would have had to have been for them to be like, you know what would be better than going to face them is going back to Egypt and into slavery. I can't even picture, or, enough time had passed where they're like, oh, that wasn't that bad. Yeah. But that's always my initial reaction to that too. I'm like, those guys must have just been utterly terrifying if they were like, you know what? Maybe if we just...
Yeah, maybe. Although, to be fair, Colin, they also, when they're in the desert, like, well, there's no food here. We got to go back to Egypt. Well, okay, there's food falling out of the sky, but it's the same food every time. We need to go back to Egypt because they had meat. And, so I don't know if it was necessarily the Giants were so freaking big, but, like, sometimes the uncomfortable that we know is more comfortable than the uncomfortable that we don't, right?
And the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. So they were doing it before, so why wouldn't they do it now?
Well said.
I also think something that is really great for not only myself, but everyone that's listening too, is that when you are going through these things and then you're like, hey, I'm going to pitch something that's not the Sunday school version, this is not Craig going out on a limb and being radical here. I love the reassurance that you were checking this against the community, because in your heart, first and foremost, you want to be true to the text, not say something new.
Yeah, not for the sake of novelty.
Exactly.
Only if what I believe is that's the best way to interpret the text.
But I think that's super reassuring here from somebody who has not been in seminary, somebody who loves learning and loves listening to the preaching every weekend. It's just really reassuring when it's like, oh, I've never thought about that before. The backing in that is a community of scholarly insight into this idea. So I really like that.
Oh, good.
So that's reassuring. I'm glad you brought up Abram, and I love you talking about how the situation applied, a little bit of behind the scenes here. And the reason it is because, God doesn't do anything accidentally through his text or anything like that. So the fact that it wasn't mentioned here, but it was mentioned later, probably helps us to, kind of walk down this path this way. One of the things you mentioned with Abram is you said Abram let his problems overshadow God's promises. It was one of my little takeaways from this week. And I wanted to push into what are some ways we can do the same today? How can we train ourselves to trust in God's promises rather than kind of falling back on our circumstances? And I know that's kind of a head and the heart issue. Heart knows I need to kind of turn my face towards God and trust in him. But then you're sitting there, and recently, my kitchen sink exploded. And so we're sitting there and we're like, you're standing ankle deep in water and you're like, well, this is my circumstance now. How can I remember to turn and face God? What are some things that you found helpful?
Yeah. So, I do think it happens all the time. It's almost cliche, but I do think it's probably worth using this angle simply because I think it's something most people that are going to be listening have probably experienced. And by the way, if you have, throw it in the comments, say amen, right? Mm-hmm. Like marriage is a good example, right? Like, yeah, I think we can have this idea that if I can just get married, everything's going to be so great. And marriage is awesome. But it's also painfully awesome sometimes, because that's part of the whole, I think the molding and shaping process of becoming who God wants us to be often requires removing a bunch of stuff, and that's never a comfortable process. Marriage is a great place that happens, though, right? So yeah, you get into marriage and you realize, oh, yeah, this was the promised land, but how do I do marriage well, right? And how do I get my needs met, but really first I meet your needs, which ends up meeting my needs, but it didn't always feel like that. So how do I balance talking about what I need versus serving you and what you need? And that's a really difficult kind of a situation. And I think, unfortunately, part of the reason that we have so much divorce is because people come to the marriage thinking it's promised land, experience the problems, they're like, well, I need to pack up and I need to find somebody else, right? My pastor when I was in college used to do this thing. He would say, when you get married, it feels like this. And your first thought is like, everything just fits so neatly into this. We're all connected and it's great. And then you kind of realize that this need is out here. And you're like, oh, that's no good. I got to get that need met. And then you find somebody else who meets that need. Oh, right. Got it. Oh, but now there's this need, right? And now there's this need. And so there's that constant shifting thing. So rather than engaging in how do I learn how to do this well, I just pack up and leave, which is, I would argue, a little bit what Abram did and what the Israelites were constantly trying to do. So marriage is a place that it happens. Unfortunately, I see families that, especially dad abandons the kids because we had kids, and it turns out it's much harder than I thought it was going to be. I remember there was a time, actually, when I got to Mission Hills, we were absolutely convinced, and I remained convinced God was leading us here. We got here, and it turned out there were more problems than I anticipated. It was a church that it was really, it was a new mega church in many ways. They had just gone over that threshold just a little bit before I got here, and it broke a lot of systems, and there were just a lot of things that we had to figure out together as leaders here at Mission Hills. And I remember in that first year, there were a lot of moments I was like, I would like to go back to my last church. I love the church and I love the people, but the problems were so overwhelming that I really wanted to go back. But what I had to do was go, I really trust that God led. I believe that where God guides, he provides, right? He guided us here, so he's going to provide here. And then the question became not, how do I deal with these problems? It became less about looking at the problems and more about looking for the provision. And so I started going, God, how are you going to provide so that I can deal with these problems in this place that you've led me, right? And so then it began like, what are the mentors in my life God's provided? Who are the teammates that God has provided? What are the books that God has provided? What are the podcasts? There was just a lot of that kind of thing that was going on. But it was really, that's how you deal with it, I think. You're like, okay, there are problems. If I look at the problems, they become so big, they blind you to everything else. So I'm not going to look at the problems. I'm going to look for the provisions to deal with the problems in the place that God has promised to provide. A lot of P's there.
No, that's perfect. Another thing that you and I have talked about too is whenever you're looking at a problem, I always think about my wife's a physical therapist, and maybe the problem is a bunch of different symptoms that are adding up to a problem. And if you don't address the symptoms, the problem's never going to go away too. So I would also suggest trying to break whatever problem you're looking at down into kind of its core components a little bit. Because one thing, my wife always talks about is people have lower back issues. And they're like, I need to strengthen my lower back. And she goes, a lot of the time you have tight hamstrings that's pulling on your lower back. So you need to either strengthen and do some stretching for your hamstrings. It just kind of pulls on that lower back and then causes that issue. And you're like, so you start doing a little bit of hamstring stuff, some stretching, and you're like, my back pain's gone. And you're like, isn't that amazing how when you treat the symptoms, the problem kind of not only resolves itself, but, becomes less. So that's always a piece that we've talked about a little bit also, where if you can kind of break it down into these bite-sized pieces and individually attempt addressing those symptoms rather than looking at the problem right here, and you're like, I can't even see this thing anymore. But if you're like, hey, if I just start stretching my hamstrings 10 minutes in the morning, we'll figure this thing out.
There's a law for that. I can't remember the name of the law. You got Murphy's Law, right? There's a law, and I can't remember the name of it, but the law basically says that if you can describe the problem clearly and succinctly, you're more than 50% of the way to solving the problem, which is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, that's
like what is the problem? And once I do that, then suddenly, these symptoms are here. The contributors to it suddenly become clear because I've got a lens for doing that, right?
Yeah.
Like if my lower back is hurting. Okay, what part of my lower back is hurting? Like where? Because it's not my back. There's all kinds of, Emily knows, right?
Yeah.
There's all kinds of different layers to that. And I've tried to tell people, I got back pain. They're like, well, yeah, but what kind of back pain? Mm-hmm. Well, the moment you can really clearly describe the back pain, you can suddenly begin to go, here's muscles that are connected to it. Let's take a look at those, right? So yeah, being able to describe the problem allows you to move from the symptoms to the contributors to that, to the underlying causes.
There's a comedian, Hannibal Buress, and he talks about how he hurts his back, and he goes, I don't know if you know this about your back, but it's most of your body. And so I always think about that too when people have back pain. You're like, yeah, that's true. Another question I want to ask you here is you had a quote that was, you can be a financial success and a faith failure. And I think especially today with our social media culture and all these influencers are on the rise and people are making money from TikTok and this, that, and the other, we are inundated with these things where that is what success looks like. How have you done as somebody who embraces technology? What are kind of some pieces that you've put in place in your life that maybe we can glean from this, where it's, keeping in mind that we should be a faith success, and that doesn't have to be hand in hand with a financial success, kind of just distinguishing these two pieces as to not put our faith in this kind of materialistic thing.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's helpful to compare a little bit the modern culture that we live in to the biblical culture. Because there's something interesting that I think is happening in the modern culture. It's the same thing that happened in the biblical culture, but we don't frame it the same way. So in the biblical culture, there was a very clear mentality, both in Israel and beyond that, throughout the ancient Near East, that said, if you are wealthy, the gods must be pleased with you. And so that found its way into Israel as well. If God is pleased with you, then you're going to be financially wealthy. Or maybe not even necessarily that, but if you are wealthy, God must be pleased with you, right? And that usually involves a misinterpretation of some Bible verses, because there is this sense that when God looks with favor, it grows greater. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. But the greater isn't necessarily greater financial success, worldly wealth, those kinds of things. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, right? But there was this idea that, yeah, if you're wealthy, then obviously you must be a financial success, or you must be a faith success. And Jesus very clearly spoke against that, and it was one of the reasons I think that some of the religious leaders struggled with him, because he talked about the wicked wealthy. And that was kind of an oxymoron in the ancient world. They're like, no, they can't be wicked, or they wouldn't be wealthy, right? And so Jesus really challenged that. I think we actually do the same kind of thing today, which is if you have worldly success, whether it's financial or influence or whatever it is, then in some sense you must be doing okay. And we wouldn't say the gods are pleased with you or that God is pleased with you, but it does creep into that sometimes, right? You look at somebody who's really financially successful in the church, and it's really easy to go, well, God must have blessed them. That's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that he hasn't blessed them. You got to ask the question that I was asking there, which is, how did you acquire it, and what do you do with it? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you handle it? Those are much, much more important questions. And again, not to be simplistic, but one of the main ways you deal with it in a way that's godly is you give it away. I think it was Charles Wesley who said, some people's spiritual gift is making as much as they can so they can give as much as they can, right? And I think as we're seeing in this series over and over again, whether it's financial or other kinds of worldly success, the way that we keep it from owning us is that we consistently give it. We consistently practice a generosity with it. Because when you're giving something away, it can't stick around and hold on to you, right? The less you give, the more likely it is to get you. The more you give, the less likely it is to get you. I think I got that one right.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
You get the point, yeah.
It's truly treating yourself as the middleman, really. I mean, you're like, okay, I work this job and I'm getting this input, but it's not mine, it's God. So I am the conduit to doing the generosity piece here.
Yeah.
So
And again, it's not just all money.
Sure.
And I've said this before, and I think it bears saying again. I think because we get so uncomfortable talking about money and possessions in the church sometimes, because we don't want to be compared to televangelists and stuff like that, it's really tempting to go, yeah, I mean, it's not just money, it's also your time and your talent and all that kind of thing. And that's true. But I do think we have to acknowledge that Jesus never says that your time is a spiritual stronghold of the enemy. He never says that. He never says, how you're spending your time, that's where your heart will go. He says where your treasure is, and that's a financial word, right? So I do think we have to recognize that there's a reason why the Bible consistently talks about possessions and money as a spiritual stronghold. Having said that, it isn't just money, right? So I'm in a place in my life in leadership where I have more free time than I used to. Like I'm above the horizon a little more 30,000 foot view. So I'm not doing a lot of stuff I used to do. I don't do counseling for the most part, right? I'm not designing the sound system like I used to in my old church. I'm not fixing the lighting systems. So that in some ways I am not as busy as I used to be. So you could say I have more time. Okay, what am I doing with it? If I'm just using it to watch TikToks, if I'm just using it to hang out and getting more selfish in the process of doing that, okay, that's not good. So how do I use my time generously to serve others, maybe in different ways, but I'm still looking to give that time. It's a lot of what I do actually now when I don't have to do all the detail things that I used to do, because we have an amazing team who does those, is I coach other pastors. I'm available to other pastors to take calls and help walk them through how to handle certain issues, those kinds of things. So it's the same principle. Mm-hmm. You get more of it, you give more of it. And the more you give it, the less it's able to get hold of you in a way that becomes deeply unhealthy.
That's great. You're focusing on executing rather than accumulating. I like the differentiation between that there. One of the other things I think is really valuable when you tune into a podcast, you follow somebody on social media, you subscribe to a newsletter, is you want a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. You kind of follow them because you're like, I am in this community. I want a little bit more than they're giving out to the general public. So I was hoping you could just give us a little bit on what Scott Rideout's going to push into this weekend and a little bit of how the Timothy initiative is plugged into Beyond here as we're looking into a really cool weekend with Scott.
Yeah, so Scott Rideout, if you don't know Scott, Scott's a great friend. He's a mentor in my life. He's also a friend. And I met him because he was the president of Converge, which is our denomination, back when I first came on at Mission Hills. He's since moved over to the Timothy Initiative. So Scott's going to be teaching on Abraham and Isaac. Very famous, very strange story where God says, I want you to sacrifice your son, which interesting implications. Obviously, he's forecasting what he was going to do. He kept Abram from doing it. God went through with it. He didn't require Abraham to go through with it. But there was something in there, I think, about like, are you willing to actually put your money where your mouth is when it comes to trusting the provider and not the provision, right? So Scott's going to be teaching on that. It's tied into the whole Beyond series because, again, it's that principle. Where does your trust lie? And we got to constantly be transferring our trust. The Timothy Initiative that Scott serves with, I love what they do. They are doing church planting in the least reached people groups of the world and doing an incredible job of it. If I get these numbers right, I think it took them 17 years to get to 200,000 church plants, which sounds like a crazy number of church plants, but also keep in mind, they're in parts of the world where they're not building buildings, right? They're not multi-staff churches. These are house churches, because if you build a building, they're going to burn it down. A lot of antagonism against the gospel, a lot of persecution. So these are small churches, and it's a leadership development pipeline is what they've done. They've created church planting processes that will raise up leaders who raise up leaders who raise up leaders. So 17 years to get to 200,000 churches. They think they're probably going to double that in the next 3 to 4 years, because they got the system going, and it's impressive. I've met their leadership. I've talked with their highest leadership. I've investigated. I've seen their systems. I've seen their processes. I've got all of their materials on my desk, and I've read through them, and I'm like, this is good stuff. So I'm really excited about them because this is a place that I want as a church to pour into, not just the Front Range, but also to use some of the resources we have in the Front Range to reach people around the world where the resources just don't exist, right? So we got a lot of work to do here in the Front Range, but we need to go beyond that and do international things as well. And so we're definitely looking to do some investing in church planting through the Timothy Initiative. And so Scott will talk a little bit about that this weekend too, and again, I'm pretty pumped about it.
That's so cool. One of our core values here is being kingdom-minded, and that's always one I like to reflect on because it's all about focusing on what's happening on the outside of the four walls of the church that we have, built here in Littleton, Colorado, and thinking about kind of what those frontiers look like globally. So super excited to have Scott in, talk through the Timothy. Craig, it's been great being here with you again today. We'll be on a break next week. Usually we don't follow up a guest speaker with an episode, so we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. In the meantime, if you guys are looking for any more content, check out Questions with Craig. Tons of questions that he answers in there that are super great, and I think sometime in the summer we're gonna have a mailbag, so if you guys want to email us at info@missionhills.org, we would love to get some questions from you guys, and we'll see you soon.
Sounds great. God bless.
This podcast is hosted by Colin McFarland along with Craig Smith. We are mixed, edited, and produced by Zach Anderson. Our creative director is Colin McFarland. Maddie Brouwer is our SEO and copy specialist. The Continuing the Conversation feed is part of the Mission Hills Podcast Network in Littleton, Colorado, and available for download wherever you get your audio and video podcasts. Thanks for listening.